Spectral cloud layers can be modified and edited to create a lot of different types of effects in different shapes. So we're going to take a look at creating some custom spectral cloud layers to create some neat looking text and also different shape clouds we can add in to your scenes and just isolate them if that's specifically what you want to work on. So we're going to start out by going into the atmosphere editor, and under the cloud tab we're going to add in some spectral clouds, and I'm going to start out we're going to use the cloud puffs preset to begin with, and we just need to make a few modifications to this existing preset before we can go ahead and customize it. So the first thing I want to do is adjust our altitude just to bring it a little lower to the ground. I'll go ahead and bring it down to 50. I'm also going to decrease the height, and we can take a look in our front view with this nice gray bar that's showing up to show us exactly where the clouds are going to be in the scene. And now, with our settings the way they are with these presets, we're going to need to modify density and cover and things like that. But first, let's take a look at setting up the shape we want. I'm going to go ahead and edit the material. Now we can see our density production is mainly right now a function. So if we take a look at our function, we can see we have a simple fractal mixed with a noise node with the combiner node multiply. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete those. And what I want to use is an image map. And I've already created a couple of images that I'm going to use to create specific shapes. So we want to add in a texture map node, which we have set to projected texture map. We can go ahead and load in our different images, and what I have is the asileFX logo, a paw print, and a rabbit. Let's start with the rabbit, and what we're going to do is just create a cloud that's in the shape of a rabbit. It's kind of neat, and we can either repeat this across the sky or just have one cloud that looks like it, and then we can kind of add these layers into your scene. And since the update of View to 6.5, we can now blend those different cloud layers together, so that way you can mix this into your scene a little bit better. Let's change our tiling mode on the X and the Y to none, and that way we just have one shape that we're going to have in the sky and just one cloud that's showing up in the shape of this rabbit. I'm going to change our mapping mode to flat vertical, so we're going down from the top, and then we want to connect our density to the grayscale output of this texture map node. Now we may need to invert the layer depending on how the shape is going to turn out. We also may need to adjust our size. So let's reposition our scene a little in our camera so we can get a better look at our cloud layer. And I'm going to go ahead and just zoom out here, adjusting the field of view so we can view it a little bit wider, and then moving our camera out. And that way we can really see this cloud layer. Right now it looks like it's a very, very large cloud, and we have a cutout of our rabbit. So what we will need to do is invert that layer. Go to the atmosphere editor, and I'm going to change our scale down to 1, and then edit material, edit function, and invert that rabbit layer. I'm also going to adjust our scale and bring this down to 0.1, and that way we have a much smaller cloud, something we can work with a little easier, and that doesn't fill up our entire scene. And we just want to reposition the camera so we can see this from above right now, and then we can go ahead and move this below. But right now we can already see we have a rabbit-shaped cloud. We're going to go to our render options, and I'm going to change this to final, render to screen, And I'll render this at 640 by 480, and we can just take a look at how this cloud looks with our default settings, because of course we will need to make some modifications. Click OK. Now one thing we can see is it looks more like a cookie cutout. We have these very highly raised areas, and it doesn't look very realistic because of that. So there's a couple of things we can do to adjust how much we want to fill in this shape, and whether or not we need to adjust our image in order to kind of smooth out those edges. We can kind of take a look at that after we've made some modifications. But really, overall, we won't need to adjust the actual image because we have filters we can use within the function editor to kind of do that for us. So we'll go back into the atmosphere editor, and if we take a look at the detail amount, we could either increase that or decrease it. But let's go into our material and edit our scaling. I'm going to scale this up because we do already have sort of a preset cloud shape that is built in to just about every cloud. And I'm going to turn off our custom cloud layer just so we're really working with the default, and now adjust our variations, and we can adjust the roughness and just kind of change our cloud a bit. Now we want to adjust our density, and now the more we decrease this density, we're going to see our edges start to disappear a little, and also the cover is going to affect how much we're filling in that surface. Once we reach a certain cover amount and we're going beyond 50%, it's really going to be too much for an image map. So we want to make sure we're at 50% or below. And as we decrease that cover, we can increase the density to make that look a little better. Adjust our opacity amount and ambient lighting if we want to brighten up the cloud. We still have our detail amount, altitude variations we can play around with, and then we can increase the height. If we want a very flat cloud, we can adjust that as well. So let's take a look at this now with these edited settings. And we can see that we still have kind of that cookie cutter shape cut out of this rabbit. And we can really tell that by our projected shadow on the ground, which is really giving us two different shadows because of the way the image itself reacts with this spectral cloud layer. So what we need to do is adjust our image and function a little. We're going to go into the atmosphere editor. First I'm just going to increase our main camera view all the way. Then we'll go into our atmosphere editor, edit the function, and now we're going to select the link between our texture map and our density and add in a filter. And what we can do is use a Gaussian and just contrast. And right now at this point we're not really seeing our clouds as a cutout. We need to reconnect our filter to that specific texture here. And we're just really paying attention to our preview, and it looks like the Gaussian may not be the best. We can go to bias, and if we need to, we can adjust the actual image map. But we should be able to get away with using some of these different filter settings. And we could change this to the smooth map and reconnect it, and then kind of adjust our lower values and the upper clip. And there's a couple of other filters we could use. Really, smooth clip would work a little better. But let's go ahead and just change this image out to something a little more blurred, because it kind of end up being a little easier. So now we have a blurred version of this image to really help those edges. We'll go ahead and invert that. And now we can see we have less of that cookie cutter shape. And then if we add a filter, there's a couple of different ones we can use. We'll be able to adjust that overall blur amount. But really having that initial blur in the image itself will really help you use these filters. So now I'm using the bias in between as a filter, and you can see we can really thin it out on our edges or increase it, but we still have a really nice looking blur. And then we can adjust our scaling amount more, decrease that so we have a little more cloud variation, roughness. We could use that custom cloud layer profile and modify that if we wanted to. So there's a lot of different things we could do to modify this shape. Adjust the cover and kind of fill that in a little bit more, and then adjust our shadow density. Let's go ahead and do a quick render of this. And now we can just see that rabbit shape, and it looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and incorporate that into a regular sky. So I'm going to readjust our camera settings and just kind of have us looking up into the sky. Go to our atmosphere editor, and I'm going to increase the altitude of that rabbit. We can see that showing up. If we need to, we can modify the position of this image map. We could rotate that around, flip it upside down so we can see it a little bit better, really depending on the orientation of the camera. Adjust our detail amounts. In detail amount, what we can see here will actually cut away from our cloud. And we get some really neat looking effects just by playing around with these settings. And if you want to blur it a little bit more, you can do that. What you can also do is just copy this cloud layer and make another one on top and on the bottom with a reduced scale, and that way you can play around with your edges a little bit more. But let's go ahead and add in just another set of clouds. And we'll use the high cumulus. And if we take a look at the different altitudes, we just want to match these up. So our rabbit layer that we have, let's go ahead and just change our name by clicking on it. We're going to call that rabbit. We have an altitude of 247, so let's go ahead and take our high cumulus and change that to 247. And then we can adjust our height and the cover a little, maybe reduce our scaling of that cloud, and the density, and just kind of play around with that. Edit the material if we want to adjust the scaling amount, how many variations we want, and so forth. And really what we can do with this is just blend together different cloud layers with these shapes that we have. Rabbit we're using in this case. And if you take a look at the full sky and really up in the air, so you can add nice little shaped clouds into your scene. And you might want to tweak it a little bit more in order to have a little bit of a better blend. We could always adjust our high cumulus, the higher ambient lighting amount, and then if you need to move, in this case our rabbit, what we can do is adjust the origin of our material. So if we go into our projected texture, we have origin amounts on the X, Y, and Z, and also an image offset. So we can use these amounts in order to kind of move this throughout the scene rather than having to adjust the image and adjust the other clouds to kind of fit. So we can see with 50 on the X, it's moved a little bit too much. Let's go ahead and do a negative value 2. Yeah, a little too much. And now we can just see that rabbit off to the side. Reposition our camera. And it might be a little stretched out, mainly because of the way our zoom is working. We'll go ahead and try to move under it a little bit more. And now we have a nice little rabbit-shaped cloud in the sky. And we can increase the altitude if we want to raise it or lower it. We could also increase the height. And that'll also help blur it out a little bit more and give more depth to the overall shape of our object. And I'm going to switch this to a 16:9 render. Make it a little bit larger. Go to our atmosphere editor and just adjust our quality boost a little higher so it'll be less grainy. And then we can adjust that other cloud layer. Maybe we want to have that a little smaller so we can see some more clouds in the sky. And that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and render that out and take a look. And now we can see the scene looks really neat and we have a cool looking sky, although we might want to just adjust those colorations, basically the opacity and our ambient lighting on each of the cloud layers so they would match up if we're going to be blending them together. But overall I think that looks pretty good. Now what we can do is go ahead and change out that shape and take a look at something else. So we're going to go back to the atmosphere editor. I'm also going to pull out this view on our side in our preview render, and that way we can get a much better idea of how the scene looks. And it does take a little longer to render that preview. Since it is so large, but it does look pretty good. So let's go ahead and edit our rabbit. And we'll change this projected texture map to our paw print. Want to make sure we invert it. And we can rotate that around. And now we can kind of see a nice little paw in our sky. We can adjust the scaling of the material inside to have some more variation. Maybe increase our detail amount, decrease the cover. And then if we take a look at balancing our ambient lighting settings, we can see that the ambient lighting needs to be a little bit higher on our rabbit, and then the opacity amount also needs to be a little bit more. And let's go ahead and render that out. And now we can see, just with that paw in there, it looks really neat. We've got a custom cloud. If we want to remove some of that graininess that we see in the render, we can of course increase the quality of our render. I'm just using final render right now. But it gives you a really good idea how you can modify our cloud layers to create really interesting looking shapes and make your scene a little more fun. What we can also do is create some special effects text, and I'll show you that in just a sec. But another thing we have to keep in mind, and I want to bring up, is of course cloud animation, because you might want to animate your clouds and then also have these shapes animated. Well, the nice thing about this technique is, since most of this detail is being created but just by that built-in cloud shaping fractals that we have, we'll be able to animate this just as we would with any other cloud, and that way we can match everything up and give some really neat looking effects. So let's take a look now at creating some special effects text that we can use with basically the same method. I am going to create a new scene, and we're going to go to our atmosphere editor, and in clouds, add the low cloud layer, edit our material, edit our function. We can remove that gradient that's set up, and now we can see too a little bit better of how these clouds are being created. And if we turn off the custom cloud layer profile, we can see just that built-in fractals that we have that has to do with our detail amount, and then also our scaling and roughness within the material itself. Let's go back into our function. We're going to add in projected texture map, flat vertical. We do not want to repeat this. We don't want them to carry out throughout the sky. And we're going to load in the asileFX logo. And I've got a blurred version of this, so we'll be able to adjust our edges. If we take a look right now, we can see a giant text object in the sky. So we'll want to reduce our scale to something a little more manageable. And now we're going to take a look and go ahead and find this object and this cloud we have. And now we can see that showing up. Right now, we'll also need to invert this layer because we can see we basically just have a box, which means it's showing up inverted, and we're just going to have a cutout of our text, which is a really cool thing you can do. So if you have a cloud layer and you want to cut away objects or words into that cloud layer, that's another way we can work with our scenes. I'm going to change this to a 16:9 ratio, and we can see that a little bit better. Let's go into our atmosphere editor, decrease the height, and now we can see that logo is cut out into our cloud, which is kind of a neat effect that we can do. And if we have a cloud layer already that we just want to blend this together with, and we don't just want to have that block, we could also kind of use a transparency method to cut away different shapes. But if we invert this now, we're just going to see the logo showing up. And it looks like I will need to stretch this out just a little bit on our X. And maybe not that much. Let's go ahead and do 1, 2. And that looks a little bit better. And now we can adjust the scaling, the roughness of this material, how many variations we want, and we'll go back into our regular settings, adjust altitude variations, and of course our lighting on this object, adjust our density, and now we've got a really neat looking cloud version of the asileFX logo. Let's go ahead and just render that out and take a look. I'm going to go to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab and just increase our quality boost a little so we have less grain. And that's pretty neat looking. We can also adjust our color of these clouds, so they don't necessarily have to be white. If we go back into the atmosphere editor and go to our cloud layer, we can see by adjusting the material we have a volumetric color. So really I can change this to any color I want. Let's go ahead and use sort of a reddish orange color. And now we can see that showing up. And the more we adjust some of these settings, the opacity, we can make it brighter, more of a glow. We can adjust the density, make it even darker. And we also have it turned on for shadows right now. If I go back into our material, go to lighting and effects, we can select whether or not we want it to cast shadows or have internal shadows. So if I turn off internal shadows, we end up with a very flat surface, but it can still give us a really neat looking text effect. And depending on the material that we have underneath, If we change our ground plane and just adjust the color of that to black, so we have a much better contrast, we can go ahead and render that, and see it's just a very flat overall shading of these clouds, but it still looks pretty neat, and we can do quite a bit with it. So let's go back and turn on internal shadows, and we really don't need cast shadows on at the moment. We can play around with our density settings, adjust the cover, and then of course play around with the height. If we want to make it very flat, we could thin it out, or we could make it very high and have it sort of coming out at us. And just gives us a really neat way of modifying our surfaces. We'll go ahead and increase our ambient lighting, make that glow a little bit more. We'll go ahead and render that out. We can see that looks really neat. Another thing to keep in mind is, since these are clouds, we can adjust their animation. If we don't want them moving through the scene, then we don't need to worry about velocity. But if we have rate of change on, then that built-in fractal that's making up our cloud is going to move and give us some really neat looking motion. So let's go ahead and increase our rate of change. And I'm going to set up a little bit of an animation. So I'm going to hit F11 on the keyboard. We'll go ahead and make this 4 seconds. So we'll drag our slider into 4 seconds, right mouse click, and with our ground selected, we can just add a position keyframe. Our ground isn't moving, but it's just enough to set our overall animation in the timeline to render out our previews. So we'll right mouse click on our preview. I'm going to set this to final. We have it set to 4 times. And I have 30 frames per second right now. Whether or not we need that full amount to really preview it is really up to you. But I'm going to set this to 15 frames, so we have half the amount of frames render a little bit quicker, and it'll still give us a good idea of the motion. So now we can take a look and play out this animation, and really, since the frame rate that the tutorial is playing at is different from the frame rate this animation is playing at, it's not going to show up perfectly. But we can scrub through and just see that motion and how our different clouds are changing. And I'll also go ahead and render out a little video, and that'll be included with the tutorial so you can see exactly what this is going to look like. We could also do other things with this text object. Now I'm using the blurred image right now. Go ahead and edit our material, and let's go ahead and change that to the crisp version. We'll select our projected texture map, and we'll load in the crisp version, invert that, and now we can see we have those sharp edges and more of that cookie cutter look. We can invert it, and now we can see our cutout in our clouds looks a little bit better. And if we wanted to, we could mirror it on our different axes. And if I go ahead and zoom out our camera a little, we can see that we have more than one logo. We could repeat it. And if I invert, we can see the different repeats that are going to be showing up. Zoom out. And we have that mirrored effect right now. Change it to repeat. And now we just have a bunch of the logo copying itself. If we change that back to none, then we're just going to be working with that one text object again. So we'll go ahead and zoom in back to that object. And we can also edit this a little bit more by blending this projected texture map with some fractals. I'm going to go and load back in the blurred version. And let's add in a combiner node, which we have set to Blender right now. and I'm going to add in a fractal node, and we can connect that to our blender. And then if we want, we could subtract that amount. I'm going to decrease our wavelength, make it a little bit smaller, and by setting that to subtract, it'll just remove specific areas. We could also use blend, so we will have clouds mixed together with the logo, and that gives us a pretty neat looking effect. And as I blend this a little bit more, the logo starts to disappear in the text, and we start to see just our cloud. So it's a really neat way we could have not only the shape, but also the cloud layer itself together on one cloud layer instead of multiple cloud layers. And we can go through the different blending settings in order to see what it's looking like. Of course, this is all the same color when we're blending this. So what I can do is also take another cloud layer, put it underneath, change the color, add some animation, and really end up with some neat looking logos and text effects. And I'll just go ahead and delete those other settings. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And what I want to do now is I'm going to change the name just to asileFX, and we can save out this material and this cloud material, and I'm just going to call this asileFX cloud logo, and we want to make sure that we're incorporating the texture map and compressing the file, and that way that logo image will be saved with the material. If you have everything kind of on a network drive or one hard drive where everything's saved and you don't need to worry about that extra file being included, then you don't need to compress it or incorporate the texture maps. But if you are going to be kind of moving this from different systems, or it's something that if your computer, you lose the information, this way that is always saved into the file. So that's kind of a good thing to do. So now I can add in another cloud layer, and I need to just load in that library with that cloud in it. And I have our asileFX cloud logo. Click OK. So now we have more than one of the same exact texture that we can use in the scene. Of course, our altitude amounts are a little bit different, and sometimes your settings won't carry over. In this case, our altitude amount was changed when we saved it out. So all we need to do is really adjust that altitude and bring it down a little lower. And what I want to do is go into the material and edit our volumetric color. And let's go ahead and make it more of a yellow. So now we have a fade between yellow to that orange color. And we can decrease the height, maybe increase or decrease our cover amount, density, opacity, and then adjust our detail amount too, just a little bit. Go into the material, adjust the roughness and the scaling, just so it's different from the other one. And this works a little bit better than just right mouse clicking on this preview, copying the material, and then pasting it onto a new material, because you don't have all of these settings saved over. And that can be really helpful. Let's go back to that top layer where we have that orange color and make it a little bit darker. And it'll blend together a little bit better. Maybe we'll pull that up to a brighter orange. Yeah, and now that is showing up a little bit better. Edit that yellow. Make it more towards white. And we can see that showing up. Increase that detail amount, and we could just add multiple layers. If we take a look at the altitude, they're 5 meters apart right now. If I want the lower one to be a little bit closer, go ahead and bring that up to 68. So now they're only 2 meters apart, and we've got an even nicer blend. Adjust the opacity amount, And then we could also add in our cast shadows on both of our materials if we want to have those projecting shadows on other items. And I'm going to adjust our camera just to look down on this a little more and get rid of some of that perspective. And we can just play around with this until we get kind of what you're looking for. In this case, we can create a really neat looking logo. We could animate it and just get a different kind of effect that you would normally expect from your typical animation. And we could also add, like I was saying before, another cloud layer with a different color. So let's go ahead and add in another spectral cloud layer, just one of the presets that comes with. Let's use large cumulus number 2. Adjust our altitude to be lower than our current clouds, and its height to be a little lower. Adjust our cover, really kind of fill that in, increase the detail amount, and then we can change the color of this layer to be, let's go ahead and use a blue. And now we have another layer that we can put in the background and animate as well. And it's just really neat ways to play around with these custom shapes and modify scenes and create things in Vue you wouldn't normally be able to create. Typically the way you would do something like this is to create a meta cloud and then kind of shape it to fit the way you want to. But using an image map, in this case, we have a lot more control over our shape, and of course it's just a lot quicker. So I'll go ahead and render this out. First I'm going to go ahead and just increase the height of those new clouds we added. Make it a little more interesting. We can blend them together. Adjust the opacity amount, maybe the ambient lighting, brighten it up, and play around with our densities for our logo. Let's go ahead and just do a render of this, and we can take a look at our custom text object. And now we can see that rendered out, and it looks pretty good. We could always use our post-processing settings as well, if we want to modify the overall look without having to edit the actual render. But it's just something really neat you can add to your scenes and play around with it. What we could also do is modify, make different sizes. I could edit that image that I had created for the logo, and maybe on another layer use a different image or a modified image of the same thing to get some different shapes.